in similar ways, wounded in similar ways. It sounds like something that a hippie would say, but the truth is we're wounded in similar ways.
Hey guys, it's Joel with the Therapeutic Collective podcast. I had almost given up on YouTube as a thing that I was going to do, and some people had requested that I have video even for the non-interview podcasts, and I did the last one because y'all evidently want to look at me talk and see the bags underneath my eyes that you could carry groceries in. And it went super viral. It got 1,000 views across different mediums in a day, so that was successful. I guess I'll keep doing that. I don't know why that works. I'm just maybe the algorithms like it more. When I saw it jump up to 1,000, even though I'd almost given up on YouTube, uh, I heard God speak to me through that 1,000 views, and I heard his voice say, "Keep making video for the internet." So we're going to talk about the Sopranos today. And hopefully this one will rank well. I don't know why the other one, I don't know why that works. If you know, let me know. If you can help me with my SEO at all, please let me know. I love to get information for free from people who know what they're talking about in my email. It's always fascinating and fun. I'm not really sure. Back in my day, the only LLM was the only large language model was a conjunction junction. And when we talked about AI, what we meant was the Zimmerman telegraph or the Warren Commission. And when we talked about artificial general intelligence, we meant the McNamara fallacy. I'm sorry, I'll stop. So The Sopranos is an interesting show. I've wanted to do like a thing on it for a while. Ton of ink's been spilled about it, and a ton of time and energy has gone into talking about it. I mean, there's like probably more podcasts about The Sopranos than almost anything else. But I would imagine there's some short-lived ones in there too, but there's some that are still going, longer than the show is on. And one of the reasons why I think it's interesting, so we're going to talk about three things here. One, because I don't want to tread ground. I mean, a ton of people have done a lot of really good work with that. One, we're going to talk about like why I see the show being relevant in a way I don't hear a ton, like its enduring relevance. And then two, second part we're going to talk about was the therapy, to make this about therapy psychology. Like, was the therapy on The Sopranos effective in like what's happening? And like, for example, like what would have happened if Melfi had a different orientation than sort of like neo-Freudian psychodynamic? Like, what if she had been doing Jungian therapy? What if she'd been doing somatic therapy with Tony? I'd love to do brain spotting with Tony. Um, I think that would have been really effective, and what that looked like. So we'll talk about a couple of things, and there'll probably be a little chapter mark so you can skip over what you don't want to hear. One of the things about The Sopranos that's really interesting to me, like there's a show like that has this ensemble cast of people. Um, they it doesn't start out this way, but what the writers figure out pretty fast, is that everything on the show has to link back to Tony. Like everything you're seeing is actually about him. If you see someone get killed in the woods, it's because he struggled with that decision. If you see somebody talking at a bar, it's because they're about to do something that he's going to have to deal with and react to. If you see somebody doing something later, it's because they're afraid of him. There's like a couple things in the first two seasons where, really the first season, where the writing is sort of trying different things out. A lot of the arcs, like about talking about like Italian American discrimination and trying to like weigh sides of some of these issues that are largely unpopular and kind of abandoned by the show. Like they'll follow the wives more. Like there's sometimes the camera will follow Carmela or the woman watching a movie where it doesn't really have a lot to be about Tony, but a lot of those like diversions are just when Carmela is thinking about developing like her own personal life away from him, even in the later seasons where she's doing that, that's like the only time the camera follows her is where she's deciding whether or not she wants how much of like an inner and outer private world she wants from him. You know, in the later seasons is to a temporary separation or something, but in the first ones, it's like her kind of going to church, trying to have something outside of him, someplace where she knows he's not going to go. Um, like, you know, and so those shots are like at the restaurant or the gym or the church. And, you know, there's all the stuff with Carmela and the priest that kind of becomes its own thing. But pretty quickly, what the show does is it totally gets rid of anything that isn't directly about Tony's psychology. The things that you see are only something he feels guilty about, something he's going to have to handle, something that's going to be unexpected for him. You know, two people talking behind his back in a way that he's going to have to deal with. And they're all like, those sort of establishing shots in like a car chase about something that's coming up on the horizon that the driver's like about to see. And that's how the show's written. And like most shows that have this ensemble cast like don't do that. Or like I can't think of any other show really that does that. Especially not one that's good. You know? Like maybe some first seasons of television that bad shows, but like, you know, in Mad Men, Pete and Trudy are in their apartment and they're having a conversation and they're characters that like live and breathe and do things. You know, Salvatore can like go to the hotel in Mad Men and like have his own thing in a way that has nothing to do with Dom. It's just because like he's a person and you're walking through and you're seeing this cast. And with The Sopranos, it isn't that way. Like it's a show about somebody who's probably a sociopath. And everything is about them even, and I don't think the authors like intent or the writers intentionally were trying to do that. I think that the show just sort of naturally went in that direction, but it's a lot of why it works because like people talk about The Sopranos as like this metaphor for boomers all the time. Like my friend was talking about like when he was watching it that like the show that is pretty critical of a lot of things that I think conservative Americans probably like if you know how to watch it. You know, like conservative Americans loved it. That he was my like friend this is 10 years ago, but he was like talking about it. He's like, yeah, I started watching the show and some guy was like, yeah, that's the best show ever. It's got violence, it's got tits, it's got like fighting, and it's good. And you know, uh, the the show like and I don't mean conservative like politically. I just mean people who think that sort of the world that The Sopranos describes is like good. Where I think it's a critique of the things it's showing you. I mean, David Chase said recently that the show is about a society that had become so exploitive and so consumeristic and transactional that it made a mob boss have a panic attack. Um, and like, there's a ton of like ink about that and kind of boomers watching. I mean, there's a quote from the New York Times, like, was it Felix Biederman said, you know, The Sopranos is at its heart. I'm reading about the pathetic nature of decline. Decline is not a romantic, singular, aesthetically breathtaking act of destruction, but as a humiliating, slow motion slide down a hill into a puddle of filth. You don't flee a burning Rome with your beautiful beloved in your arms, barely escaping a murderous horde of barbarians. You sit down for an 18-hour day, enjoy fewer things that you used to do, and you take on the worst qualities of your parents while you watch your kids take on the worst qualities of you. So like there is that sort of like a critique of the fantasies of the boomers. This generation got everything they wanted, but did they? But there's also like I think the reason that it holds up with younger people is not just because they see their parents in it, sort of, or see something about their parents, but there is this nature of like stuff is just coming at you, and Tony has no ability to kind of plan for it or deal with it. It just is like these things just continue to happen to him, and then he reacts to them. And like some of the biggest criticisms of the show is that it's sort of like each season is about a made man doing something made men shouldn't do, and that's like all the show does structurally is be like, can a made man be gay? Can a made man be an addict? Can a made man, you know, do this? And and then he like has to deal with it. But a lot of that is why I think millennials relate to the show is because their generation felt like that. You know, like they were just like watching the next recession come. They were watching the next thing happen. Like they knew that they were there at sort of the end of something. And so even though the show gets talked about being like about boomers and characters aren't boomers, the millennials are the ones that like propped it up and made it have this enduring appeal. And it's not just, I think, because they were sorting through their relationship, but boomers are the last generation. You know, it was that they really felt that experience of just being floating, wondering what was going to hit you next in the river of life and time, and having very little control over it, other than how angry you got about the thing happening and like who you hurt, and if you hurt someone when you were sad. But the choice of like having agency and control over your life, much like Tony's experience, like isn't anything that is ever an option. So like the like the show is about like I think I don't remember exactly what it was. I remember exactly like what the back box art of like the first season said, but when I was like holding it in the dorm room in like 2005, it was like something like, Tony's just a normal guy. He's like you, he has problems with business and his wife and his mistress and his kids and his job, but there's just one difference. He's in the mob. And a lot of what David Chase is doing is being like, if you are an American that is successful during this period, it's because you're in the mob. Like you are existing as part of an economic system that's become increasingly exploitive. And so that balancing drama of like home and the work life of the mob boss and therapy sessions with Tony, has this internal driving violence, that like is always there. And that's the way that David Chase sees the world, agree with him, disagree with him. That's a lot of why he wrote it. Like, so the, so I've argued before, or I'm going to argue in the second act of the podcast, that Freudian like psychoanalysis is pretty useless for Tony. He gets insight without changing, and he also gets insight into the wrong areas to let him deflect. I'll go into more about why that is, but for this part, like the show is about Tony not changing, uh, and that is something that like as you watch him fail to change, his rationalizations and his repackaging of like his old arc as a new arc with intellectualization and introspection sort of becomes the same thing, the same route that America's taking at that time, at the time Chase is writing. As Tony is unburdening himself, he's spin doctoring his sins and explaining, why it is that actually, his suffering about making other people suffer is somehow more profound, or makes him the ultimate victim in a way that I think David Chase is probably criticizing. Bank bailouts, the war in Iraq, and the gutting of the social safety net, and that like uncanny element of how people are, that, I don't know, this that uncanny element of how like people were. Excuse me, I need to cut this. Um, So anyway, like that idea that the show is about someone pretending to go through an arc and learn a valuable lesson and change without ever really doing that is a lot of how America's like elected officials are handling all of the mistakes that America's making, is pretending that it's not the same thing that didn't work that we did 100 times before, and that we just need to double down on it harder. And so the beauty of the show, might be in sitting with the reality of, describing of analysis paralysis, that you're just describing what you're doing so much, and writing retrospectives on it and important lessons about how, what I'm doing is not who I am, and what I will continue to do forever is also not a reflection of who I am somehow. This the circular logic that you saw a lot in the press at that time. And for viewers my age, when like this was airing, I mean, I watched it not when it was on the air, but a couple years later. But I was more sort of aware of that stuff at the time I watched it. Even though, current events were not current anymore, I was more aware of them when I watched it, and you definitely saw that. But that depiction of this brutal inner workings of organized crime felt truer than these official narratives that were coming out of Washington about like, oh yeah, we're just doing this because we love human rights so much, and like, if human rights in a place are bad, we need to go there. Unless there's not oil there, then the human rights are not, uh, just that spin doctoring felt familiar. And I think the show is intentionally written to be reflective of news and media a lot of the time. I mean, there's some pretty direct references to the war in Iraq much later, when Chase is angrier and it's a lot more pointed. And, politicians would drape this imperial adventure in the rhetoric of human rights and democracy promotion. In the same way that the Sopranos crew, they talk about what they're doing as this thing that is traditional and hierarchical. You know, there's rules to it, so it's not bad. You know, as long as there's rules and a hierarchy and a tradition and it's been around a long time and it's always worked like this, then there's nothing wrong with it, right? Because those things somehow equal good, except they don't. And, you know, if corporations were camouflaging the human cost of globalization behind this slick PR and celebrity endorsements. Um, and you know, Tony's sessions with Melfi, there's this interesting dynamic where she feels like she's helping him, but by the end, she's really just sort of enabling him. Um, and not just enabling him, she's making him more effective as a mafioso and a sociopath. And I think Melfi is sort of like the NPR red wine in the bathtub, um, like watching, listening, like liberal class. Like she's the stand-in for that. Um, and like when you get to uh, that like war on terror stuff, when that starts to come into the show, and you see, you know, the FBI essentially not even caring about what Tony's doing anymore to the point where they're siding with him. Like they think he's cool. Like they always had this kind of like accidental respect. But by the end, the FBI is helping him, you know, basically, which I know is based on a real case, but I think it's in there for a reason. Um, so like the bust out scenes in The Sopranos, where you see basically short term like debt capacity and short term profit just be run through the ceiling at the long term expense of the business. That is what hedge funds do. That is what happened to Toys R Us. Like the reason that that's in there when they take over the hardware store and they're going through like, yeah, we're gonna make you buy all of this inventory and then we're gonna sell it and then we're gonna sell the building and make you rent it from yourself and then we're gonna whatever. Like all of that, like Red Lobster recently, there was like it wasn't exactly a bust out, but it was just like this kind of ridiculous scam where this company owned two companies and they realized that they needed to like the other company was like more valuable so they could tank Red Lobster by having it buy like overpay for shrimp and then resell it. And you know, now like in the when The Sopranos is airing, this is happening to like Toys R Us. You know, it's happening to like these small companies. Now we can't even see it. Like it's got so bad because it's people who are busting out, you know, 80 companies to overvalue this other 20 to sell off. Like it's the same thing is happening, but it's like less visible, less than it is than it is because it looks weirder. Like really look at the Red Lobster like shrimp thing. It's bizarre. You know, you had somebody who basically like put Red Lobster into bankruptcy because they wanted to like make other profit with this other company that they also owned. Just not the way that like economy is really supposed to work. Um, and so like one of those enduring legacies, I think, is of The Sopranos is that it sees through all of that and it also lets you be like entertained by these things. Because there's an inner logic to them that you know. Like very little of this is them explaining to you how the mafia works because they don't need to. Like you already know how it works because like Chase is saying, like if you're in America, like you're in the mob. You know, and whether we um so there's the one of the episodes later on that Chase does, like it's even about like the the Abu Ghraib prison stuff. Like they use some of the same lines. That if you're younger, you're not familiar. Abu Ghraib was like a prison scandal where you know American soldiers were running a prison in Iraq and they were keeping a lot of people there and they were allowed to torture a little bit, but then the torture got like depraved and insane and sadomasochistic, with like very strongly sexual directions, in a way that when pictures got out of it, everyone felt bad for a minute and said like, "Oh, how would this happen? Why do we have to look at this?" I don't have a problem with any of the things that happened to get here or any of the things that we're still doing. I just don't want to have to see it. And there's a lot of lines that they put in towards the end where I think Chase is probably very angry at the war in Iraq, and that becomes like apparent when you're rewatching it. And like you know, subprime lending, a lot of, you know, the mafia's money scheme comes from lending you money that you can't pay back and then taking more and more ownership over everything you've got until they own you and they own your life and then you work for the mob, but they don't have to pay you. Is there's all of the subprime lending and kind of banking, global financial stuff that's going on in the 2000s. I also think Chase is referencing like pretty strongly. And throughout the series, that lavish lifestyle, it's like very gaudy, but also like, yeah, yeah, I like it's too much. Like, there's lines where Tony and Carmela are talking about like how they have too much, or it's over the top, or how their lifestyle is like lavish and propped up by things. Like Carmela will say like, "Oh, he works so hard," as Tony will be like, "And he should. How do you think we afford this lifestyle? It's taking from him," And you're like, there's some things that are there. It's well written. Like they're not so on the nose that it's bad writing, but they are communicating an idea that the amount that Americans feel like they need to consume is too much. That there maybe should be some limits or some breaks built into this thing, and that there will be consequences. A lot of the stuff about the house, I think, is sort of like The Great Gatsby in that way, and that it's preempting a fall, it's preempting a crisis. It's saying, yeah, look at this like huge party, opulent lifestyle, but this can't end well, right? Like this isn't good. We're not going to say that, but you're supposed to feel it. Um, and the show is about somebody who is wondering whether or not they're a sociopath at the same time that I think Chase is maybe wondering if his country is acting sociopathically. The last season of the show, there's a picture of Tony looking over his shoulder angrily at New York at the Statue of Liberty, and that works because he's falling out with the New York gangsters who may or may not have come after him in that last episode, tried to come after him, but also because Tony's like looking at the Statue of Liberty. A lot of those things I don't think are coincidental. And Melfi, to go back to her being sort of the stand-in for the like liberal NPR wine mom who really wants to be on the right side of history by disliking the right people and liking the right people, but not wanting anything to change. And also not really wanting to have to look at the problem on the news. Like Melfi is more educated than anyone in the show. She's like one of the only like elite characters kind of that you see. And there's this like, professional ethics there's professional ethics that she blurs by being like so fascinated by this guy who's telling her that he's a serial philanderer and a murderer and all of these things. And I think that she is this stand-in from people who want to be like different and judgmental, but also like entertained. And in a weird way, she sort of becomes a stand-in for the audience, because that was one of Chase's like biggest frustrations with the show that he said over and over, is that people loved Tony and then they wanted him punished. And that he was like, one, like, can you not look at this guy and see that he's in hell all the time? Like, he is punished whether or not he dies. But then also, you're baying for blood after cheering him on. Like, you basically like want all of these things, but then you want somebody else to be the senator who pays the price for it. And I refuse to do that with my show. And that's like when you start seeing Chase get mad at the audience, and like um, mad at the success of the show in a certain way. Like, it was succeeding, but it wasn't succeeding correctly because it wasn't having the change that he wanted. It was proving the fact that people were liking it was also proving his theories about people right, which made him mad. And by that final season, there's a lot more anger. The show gets darker in a certain way. I think it had to. But it also, I think, became something that he didn't know how to end because he didn't want to give people what they wanted, but he wanted to do right by the story and the characters, which is why that ending is kind of an enigma. Um, that there's that idea that the show was sort of saying that the point of or the biggest threat to America wasn't outside. That the reason that we were hyper fixated on like terrorism, communism, this enemy out there who was going to come get us, was because we really didn't want to look down. We really didn't want to look inside of ourselves. And when we did, we could just take a teeny little peek, and then we had to tell Melfi exactly why it wasn't our fault, who we were. And that critique being framed through therapy is interesting. And I think like Tony's therapy itself, It was psychoanalysis that we didn't want either. Like Tony was like looking down in therapy, seeing things that were really bad about who he was, and then defending them and pretending that they were actually good and talking out both sides of his mouth. And Chase saw the audience watching the show doing the same thing in a way that really made him mad. So I don't know. That's some of the little cultural like theories and thoughts that I have on The Sopranos. The therapy on the show. So one of the things that's really interesting about the therapy is it doesn't work, right? Like I don't think there's anybody. I've heard people sort of try and make the case that the therapy is somehow effective or something. But I don't know, man. Like one, he's paying out of pocket for psychoanalysis essentially, so he's probably in Jersey. So Melfi's a psychiatrist. I think he was probably paying $300 an hour, if not more. So the amount of money that Tony spends on therapy is huge. Like think about $300. How much does he go? Once a week, twice a week, once a week for close to a decade. That just doesn't seem like a great return on investment. And a lot of people who love psychoanalysis will say, well, it's not supposed to be. That's fine. That, and I get the argument that like we don't just go to therapy for behavioral change. Like I'm a huge advocate of that. I think we go to therapy for a different energy, insight, growth. Removing lies, seeing who we are honestly, and that changes your life. It will change it profoundly. But I don't think that happens to Tony either. Like, I don't think he gets anything out of it practically, and I don't think he gets anything out of it spiritually. I mean, the only time on the show that you see good therapy being done is where there's this stand-in for Irvin Yalom. I'm like 99% sure that's what Chase is referencing there. I think me and Chase have read a lot of the same stuff and have very different opinions about it. Chase seems to like Freud a lot more than I do. But like, and he's Buddhist, so it makes sense. But at some point, when Carmela's considering leaving Tony, she goes to this therapist who sits alone in a dark room in this chair, and he talks like this, and he just tells her exactly what she needs to do. And it's jarring because it's very close to the end, and it's the only time you've been like, oh wait, therapy can do that. Like the therapist can just in 5 minutes instead of like, oh, so difficult. That reminds me of the meet that your mom had. Remember, your mom and your dad were sad too, and you're also sad. Like instead of that you've seen with Melfi the whole time, this guy's just like, take the children, what's left of them. This man is a serial philanderer and a murderer. You are not going to change him. You can only choose to lie to yourself, but you can't change this reality, and it's very unlikely that he ever changes. If you're serious about what you're saying, then the only option left to you is to take your children and leave this person, even if it leaves you poor. You will still have your soul. And if you don't do that, you won't have your soul. But it's up to you. If you choose to sell it to the devil, you probably won't know you did that. Essentially. And Carmela hears him and she makes a choice. And she makes a choice. But she hears what is on offer. And most therapy is probably not that blunt. Mine might be, but like that, I think comes in and you remember that other kinds of therapy exist in a way that Chase wants you to know when he's saying that, Melfi's therapy is failing essentially. So biggest thing about The Sopranos, Tony has alexithymia. He cannot recognize emotions. Melfi talks to him about how he's a shark that needs to keep moving to survive. And, she tries to dress up trauma in kind of sexy metaphors to make him, regretfully admit that is how he feels so that he can like hold vulnerability a little bit and instead of telling him that he's sad. But when she's doing that, like this is okay, a teeny tiny bit that I want to say about Freud here. And also something that I forgot to say in the beginning. So probably the best book on Freud. I love the biographies. Like I love a lot of the other biographies. They're very well researched. And they're interesting and they're worth a read and they like do a good job with his psychology. But there's a whole lot more information out now that wasn't out when those were written. Some of it was not out because Anna Freud covered it up. She intentionally changed things that were in the archives. Like she changed the original sources that scholars are writing about because she didn't really want or obfuscated some other things because she didn't want things to be out there. And so like the best book on this is Frederick Cruz's book, The Making of an Illusion, Freud, The Making of an Illusion. And I read that book twice. Like, I don't agree with everything that he says in there. Just as a therapist, like I think there's places where he's writing like about therapy, like it's kind of more of a science than it maybe can be. Um, but it's excellent. And one of the things that he says about Freud is that um, psychoanalysis was never a thing, because what Freud would do is he would invent like one concept, you know, with whatever emotions he was dealing with at the time, whatever drugs are in his system, that explained everything in a very reductive way. Not sex, like I'm not just sex. It was different, bizarre philosophical interpretations of how our primary motivation is somehow sexual. And then he would get rid of all of his past theories and then reduce all of his past cases and his current cases down to the little theory that he was on now. And so the idea that psychoanalysis has like any kind of consistent center, it is not real. It's not Freudian. Like it doesn't come from psychoanalysis. What it comes from is like Klein and Winnicott and Cornai to a certain extent. And these like later psychoanalysts taking things that sort of worked while operating psychoanalytically, but they don't, like psychoanalysis doesn't come from Freud because it never was one thing that you could look at and analyze. Like the thing we kind of remember it as being is like at the very end of Freud's life when he's chased off almost anybody that had any talent around him. And he has surrounded by sycophants in New York, you know, starting a secret society basically. Um, then at that point he is retconning his whole perspective and doing the same thing he always did, reducing everything down to this new theory. He's like very much into the penis at that point. He's very much into what is it, homosexuality. Like there's like a wild case study where he's like, this guy, he's like telling a guy that the guy's gay, and the guy's like, I'm not gay. And then he's like, well, the reason that you don't know that you're gay is you're actually double, triple secret gay, which is the most gay you can be. But if you're that gay, you don't even know it. And it's like, I mean, that's what he's saying, you know? So he throws all of the things out to like lull him onto the new theory. And it's like, whatever is going to win him the most fans or like let him command the room that he's in at that time. Because Freud's psychology is extremely, saying a lot more about Freud than I meant to, but you kind of need to know this, like to go through the Freudian analysis of the show. Um, like he's kind of, if I ever do the giant series I've been working on forever, I'm going to go through this again. But so Freud is, we learn what makes us lovable, right? From the parent of the opposite sex is an attachment theory thing. And we learn how to be in the world or how to function from the parent of the same sex. Freud's mother is obsessed with him. She like thinks he's the best thing ever. He's like the darling Ziggy, and she knows that he's going to be brilliant. He's born, or like she said, he was brilliant, and but before he was born, she had prophesied that he was going to be brilliant. He was born in a call, and that has the symbolic significance. And this is going to happen. And that's going to happen. And so she's telling him how great he's going to be. But his father is incredibly, not cowardly, but like avoidant and conflict averse and just shuts down. And Freud has all this shame and guilt about that. Like anti Semites would hit his father in the street, and his father would just kind of like smile and wave and put his hat back on. And Freud is like so full of shame, and he writes in his journal like these fantasies about how like his dad was really Hannibal of Carthage, and he's going to leave these elephants. And he does that like as this reaction because he learns from his mother that he's brilliant and a genius and is destined for greatness, but he learns from his father that you can't take any sort of confrontation at all. You can't take any kind of um, conflict. I mean, his like last falling out with Jung is when he just says to Jung, like Jung says to him, you know, I don't really agree with this theory. I think it's actually something else. And Freud's like, you have a death wish against me, and panics and has a panic attack. Like that's how little conflict he could do. So you have this person whose psychology is interesting because they have to be the smartest person in the room. Well, not smartest. They have to be in control of the room. They have to have like a little theory that everyone's like, oh, the thing beneath the thing that I didn't even see. But he also can't fight with anybody really. So it's always this like incredibly passive. But this is a great recipe for addiction too. Like if you have this psychology, please stay away from anything that you can get addicted to. But like So you see this happening over and over again. Like all of his relationships, he says to Adler, to Jung, and to multiple others, like you're going to be this great new thing that's going to carry more work that carries on my legacy. And then the person's like, well, I agree with half of your stuff, but not this part. And then he's like, oh no, you've fallen and become corrupt, and then finds another one. And he does that basically until he's left with people who don't have any original ideas and don't aren't really worth listening to, that just completely turn everything over to him. Um, and Frederick Cruz's book is like a really good look at that. Frederick Cruz was like a pen pal of mine. I miss him. RIP. He passed away, this year. And man, if I'm, in my 80s and I'm still that sharp and have that much rapier of a wit and that much to say about what's going on, then I don't know. That's awesome. Like I'm glad that he was able to keep that up until the end. I do want to memorialize him a little bit because I mean, I wasn't like a close personal friend or something, but I would correspond with him, and he was incredibly funny and he was incredibly nice. We had a lot of the same enemies, and we got to make fun of a whole lot of the same people, and it makes me sad to not be able to talk to him anymore. But his book's great, and I think that you should check it out. But that is one of the things that it points out about Freud, is that psychoanalysis isn't really this consistent lens. What psychoanalysis turned into was like all of these assumptions that sort of worked, mainly the detachment work with attachment that people put together later. So what is Melfi doing then, right? Like when we say someone's doing psychoanalysis, and it doesn't come from what Freud said psychoanalysis was, what does it come from? Well, what you get is this idea, one that Freud doesn't really care about these other parts of the brain. He thinks that everything evolved for natural selection, like everything evolved just to try and have sex with something else. And it leaves out, a lot of the things that like, no, we have a huge social reward network. We have like all these other reward systems that even if like maybe the first organism was just trying to like, signal how to like have more mating partners. That is such an old and base piece of our psychology. Like there's a lot more there. Freud didn't think that. He thought it all had to go back to sex or there was no point. And he, so one of the things that people take away, one, is that a lot of like early childhood impulses are all reduced to sex. Like Tony's saying he looked up to Janice because Janice was like independent and stood up, and Melfi keeps trying to turn it into like, oh, yeah, your sister can be your first sexual, attraction or something. And that's really not what he's saying. Like that isn't a very useful conceptualization for therapy. And then also, so psychoanalysis tends to do that a lot. I'm not going to go through like all the tenets of it. But that's sort of what it's assuming, that worldview of the superego, the ego, and the id. They're all parts that have to do with some sort of like sexual attraction and repression of the sexual and violent drives in humanity. But then two, like she's being incredibly relational. So she's hoping that he will sort of project on her and that he will have insight when she leads him through these emotional arcs. So psychodynamic therapy does work for relationships. Like if you don't trust anybody and you come in and you test the room and you're like, well, maybe you don't like me, and you kind of pick a fight with the therapist, and they're like, oh, what you're doing is kind of mean, but I still will respect you, and I understand you might be doing that because you're scared, and you have this repetitive experience over and over. Your ability to relate to people does get better, but those aren't really problems Tony has. He's charming. He's managing her. He's a sociopath. He's a verbal, extroverted guy. And so, like, maybe there's some of the things where somebody supporting him and understanding him in a relationship with his mother is sort of helpful for him to know that he doesn't have to he doesn't have to treat everything his mother says like it's true, that it's sometimes not respecting your parent is having respect for yourself. But the majority of it, he has alexithymia, which is the inability to kind of like feel and notice your emotions. And so because he's got that, his emotional experience is incredibly overwhelming. That is where relational therapy doesn't work. They'll say that they're going slowly or that they're moving you through it a little bit, but what happens is that you're taking somebody and you're decompensating them, and then they become like incredibly activated and overwhelmed, a lot of times regressing down to a childhood part, and then you put it back together and you act like you did something, but really like you're moving way out of the window of tolerance and spiking their nervous system. And they're just crashing. And then later they sort of have insight into why those things happen. So they're talking about like Oh yeah, I have the panic attacks around meat because I saw my dad in the mafia and he, shot the guy to get the meat. And so when I see it, it is related to violence or something, like that is maybe true on some level. And the insight is this little nugget for the therapist and the patient to feel like they're chewing on something and doing work. But the insight doesn't stop the panic attacks because the body brain is not intellectual, and insight into like why you panic doesn't stop the panic from stopping. And so there's all this talk in the show about should she refer him to a behaviorist? And there's this whole idea of like, I know he'll need his behavior to change. So the behaviorist is the only thing for a sociopath because it will change um, it will change behavior and it will just work on behavior modification. Don't do the bad thing. Being violent is bad. But I don't even think that's what Tony needs. I mean, I really think that Tony needs like somatic brain-based medicine. Like I said, I'd love to brain spot him. Like you can regulate and calm down these things. If he is in a different, better kind of therapy, I think that happens. But when you have alexithymia, and the relationships are not like your biggest issue. I mean, he does have issues with relationships. But it's because you can't feel your feelings. You're a sociopath. You can't feel sorrow, and you have to project it onto these other things because you can't feel it in these appropriate places because that part of self is so damaged. So I have to project it onto ducks or a baby. Um, when Melfi says at the end that that's an act, that the sociopath is doing that to like trick people, I don't believe that. And that last article that she reads in the end, where she decides to discharge him, where she's reading it, like, uh, I don't think he's consciously being like, I'm going to talk about babies and ducks to my therapist in order to make her think that I'm not a sociopath. That's not true. Like, I think that with a whole lot of those really severe personality disorders, you're not allowed to feel the emotion over here, but it's still part of your experience. So you have to project it over onto this other thing. And a lot of the guilt and shame that Tony feels about murdering people who he has to murder because he doesn't want to, and hurting people, that like people like Ralph Cifaretto on the show, they don't feel that. He's like very true sociopath. Tony is projecting it onto these places, or at least we don't see it. Maybe Ralph is a more complex character than the show lets you see. Tony's projecting that into things that are appropriate. And so where he gets into trouble is where he starts to project it on where the things that are appropriate overlap for him, where it's a problem at work. Like they don't really care if he likes babies. They don't really care if he likes ducks. So I can go out and kill people and then act like I don't care because I get to put my vulnerability over here and counter it that way. But it is a problem for him when it comes to women. When the women on the show are killed, like one of the biggest arcs, like there's a young girl, and he sees Ralph, basically kills this girl, and then he breaks the rules. He hits Ralph and beats him up, and thinks about having him killed, even though Ralph's a made man. He shouldn't have done that because that that person who was a young woman, that's an appropriate thing that you're supposed to feel for, and so the wires kind of get crossed there in a way that's interesting. And so like because Tony can't like mentalize and self-regulate emotion, he falls back on these coping mechanisms. So Melfi, especially towards the end of the show, is like really hurting him because what's happening is he's having all of these things that she calls insight because we regressed you down to your littles in therapy, and after you regress to your littles, then you realize this new nugget of truth about something that happened when you were 5. But then, like I said, that insight is logical. It's not the brainstem. It's not where trauma is stored. So you can know all this information about it and still do nothing with it. But then also, when she's doing that, he's doubling down on like alcohol. He's doubling down on gambling, sex, just these addictions. And she keeps spiking in therapy. And then you see Tony go out, especially towards the end, and he's leaving in more and more emotional disconnect, even as he does, get some of these Freudian insights. And so, like in many ways, Melfi's approach resembles exposure therapy for PTSD, where without first teaching, self-soothing or grounding techniques, you're just repeatedly activating trauma over and over again and hoping that if you spike it enough that eventually the person's brain will fix itself and figure out how to do it. And some people's brain will go through a trauma 20 times and then something in the brain clicks and it goes, okay, I don't have to go through that same response. I'm going to change. But that sucks to do that 20 times. And then also not everyone's brain works that way. Not everyone's brain does that. And so, as Melfi's ex-husband points out in the third season, psychoanalysis may simply, be the wrong fit for somebody with Tony's presenting problem. And like Elliot Kupferberg, I don't remember the name of the psychiatrist, but her consulting psychiatrist repeatedly asked her to refer Tony out. I'm not going to go through like all the different things that happen on the show. But I don't think he needs behavioral conditioning. Elliot wants him to see a behaviorist. I don't really think cognitive or behavioral therapy would be like the best thing for him. And Melfi does do some CBT. Like she does do some CBT grounding techniques. They do breath work. They do and CBT is fine. It's a very basic kind of look at emotion. It's not going to work for profound trauma. And you see it not work for him. And a lot of the CBT therapists that are out there that I like, that are good, when you talk to them, they're not really doing CBT. Like they've figured out how to do kind of deeply somatic or analytic therapy just because they've done therapy for so long. So like when I talk badly about a modality, I'm talking about what the author says, how it's generally applied, the biggest risks versus the rewards of that model. There's always somebody out there. I mean, there's somebody out there probably healing with crystals or something that is deeply relational and powerful. And even though maybe why they think it works isn't the reason it works, they're helping people. So you can find a bad person doing any model. But anyway, Tony stays with Melfi for years. There's not progress, and that dynamic just replicates over and over. And so, like this, I think another thing that I would be really interested in is a parts-based approach, because a parts-based approach, internal family systems or voice dialogue or any of the post-Jungian stuff, Arnie Mendel's process therapy, what you'd be doing is you'd be helping him get distance from that, because instead of just being like, you feel this way because you wanted to have sex with your sister when you were 13, or you feel this way because whatever, which is very reductive and not helpful, and Melfi does a lot of that. Or even you feel terrible, breathe, let's deal with this right now. You could really stretch Tony out in those moments and be like, yeah, part of you is having anxiety and crisis and whatever, but there's another part of you that feels this way. There's another part of you that feels that way. And then that theta wave spikes in the brain under the QEEG. Then all of a sudden, the brain starts to get perspective on itself, get outside of its uncognitive process enough to not identify with it, and then see itself from the top down and go, oh, there are multiple parts of me. And like that is the reason why those approaches work, is you're making somebody have distance from their immediate experience so they realize that they have some freedom and control over it, and that they're actually bigger than the problem that they feel like is all of them. Jungian therapy would be really interesting. Like I would love to see a Sopranos like reboot where Tony's in there talking about like his like anima obsession in his mistresses. That's not going to happen. But let's look at some of the things that could have happened, had Tony gone into therapy with a different kind of therapist. So I think a Jungian is probably immediately going to see that his relationship with his mom and Melfi are deeply influenced by his anima, and that there's this like unconscious feminine in his psyche that is pretty ambivalent. Olivia, his mom, is a very negative mother figure. She's always impacted his anima development. And even from like just an analytic perspective, we learn what makes us lovable from the parent of the opposite sex, and we learn how to be in the world by the parent of the same sex. Tony's going around and he's sort of being his father, but he's saying, I realize I got on the end of this thing, yet I'm still more successful than him. So he sort of is like a better version of his dad, and he's resolved in that part of his life, like how to be in the world. He's effective. He doesn't have interpersonal, as far as professional, but he doesn't have interpersonal issues and anxieties there. He knows that he knows how to do what he does. But we learn what makes us lovable from the parent of the opposite sex. And Tony does not think that he is lovable. He's begging the world to love him, which is what makes him compelling. It's what makes him interesting. It's probably what makes him like David Chase. Not that Tony doesn't like David Chase. It's what makes him similar to David Chase. And the thing is that people do love him. I mean, by the end, this guy who's like deeply suffering and begging for love and help and to be like seen authentically, no one confronts him. No one stands up to him. He's in control of Melfi. He's in control of the FBI. He's in control of, his organization. And I think that a lot of that goes back to that kind of millennial appeal. the millennials were kind of this generation that wanted to be in touch with community and authenticity and integrity and art and all these things they felt were like the Best Buy and the Applebee's and the Sopranos. I mean, if the boomers, it wasn't. And so instead of eating fast food, they glued, cast iron pipes and Edison light bulbs and old road signs to the walls and what the raw cinder block and tried to make, molecular gastronomy and, everything is high art. And I think that there is a lot of that sort of motivation in Tony where no one ever sees like, hey, I see you. You're hurting. You could change if you want to. You've done some really bad things. I'm not going to let you off the hook for that. But you could still change and you could still be a good person if you want to. He never has that moment in the way that Carmela does with the other therapist. So, Tony projects that anima in positive and negative ways, especially on Melfi. And on one hand, he sees her as this nurturing, understanding, good mother that he never had. When he wants her approval and her validation, sometimes, at one point sexually, other times, just kind of deeply emotionally. And then on the other hand, he projects more negative. He sees her as controlling, castrating. He accuses her of being obsessed with like money a lot. So there's a lot of hostility and paranoia sometimes, where Melfi doesn't deserve it. You see both of those coming out. His relationship with his mistress, mistresses, is probably definitely anima influenced. He's drawn to these strong, independent women that he fundamentally can't control. Like he wants something in his life that he can't win, like a lot of people do, like we all do in relationships. We go back to a game that we lost as a kid, and then we try and win it again through this kind of sexual relationship. And a lot of the time that leads you to be in, a different relationship with the same sort of problem. So like Gloria and Valentina, they're always like fiery and passionate and loud and like very emotional. But he wants them to be dependent on him until he can't control them. In the case of Gloria, what's the Russian one's name? I don't remember her. I don't remember her name. Anyway, so a lot of like the unlived life of the parent stuff, which is a big force in Jungian psychology. Menno and AJ, they're colored by like Tony's unlived potential. And Menno has the academic success, and she's allowed to go to college, and the professional world is like available to her. And Tony's like really proud because he knows that he's smart, but he also knows that he's very uneducated, and he brings that up a lot. And so on one hand, he's proud of Menno for accomplishing this stuff that he didn't have access to, but on the other hand, her like intellectual pursuits and cultural sophistication threaten both of her parents, but especially Tony. When like AJ, like he feels kind of inadequate and threatened if Meadow is like overly cosmopolitan. And so a lot of the times where she tries to connect with something that maybe is like very authentic for her, like she dates an African American, she gets into kind of world music. She is expressing these sort of like, I don't know, neoliberal ideas. And a lot of that stuff is sort of threatening to Tony, and he'll like be shaming about it and make fun of it. And by the end, you see her sort of coming back. Like she's professionally successful, but she gets the message that she's not really supposed to be that different from him. And I think that's a failure in parenting, brought about by the unlived life of Tony. So with AJ, Tony sees like AJ doesn't really care about sports. Whereas Tony's like incredibly motivated to see his own like potential validated through AJ doing these things. And he's like overly, what do you call it? Like encouraging in a way that AJ doesn't respond to. He presses him into these traditional masculine pursuits like football and military school at one point. And there are opportunities that Tony never had. And then AJ's resistance to these paths, like it amplifies Tony's own sense of failure, and inadequacy as a father. And a lot of times he gets violent. He hits him, when he's reminded of that. It's this shadow projection of all of the parts of himself that he doesn't want to have to deal with. And then you also have throughout the series, there's these moments where he catches the glimpse of the self. Like the most famous is the peyote scene, where Tony stands up and yells at the mountains, like, I get it. Is he's seeing himself from this perspective that's outside of himself. And then he tells Melfi that. He says, I see that there's something else, and I'm looking at myself, but I'm not just me, there's another thing. And I think Melfi probably would have liked Jung too. What is it? She hangs up that Ojibwe saying, and that's a very Jungian type deal. And when he's saying, parts-based therapy could have helped me when I did peyote, I had this experience. She seems like interested, but fundamentally kind of distant from that. She's an existentialist. She's kind of a nihilist. She's an atheist. Um, you can hear, even though the scene is silent, you can hear the gears in Melfi's brain reducing this down to some sort of psychological phenomenon. And not being able to engage with Tony about it, or bring that thing that is very helpful to him, probably the best moment that he has on the show, psychologically, into therapy and use it. And Yalom talks about that. Yalom criticizes Freud a lot in his book, Existential Psychotherapy. And he says that, if like people say that Freudians talk about like death or sex or like God a lot, or a lack thereof, void or whatever, he was like, but really they don't. Because there'll be this moment that could have been opening up a philosophical tension to really sit with something that is this cool, expansive mystery. And instead they're like, all right, now let's put that away. Like they'll be like, oh wow, isn't that like a wild? I forget the example that y'all uses, but he's like, they'll be like, oh, isn't that like a wild thing that, um, you know, uh, we all die and there's this other side, and that sitting with that somehow brings you peace, and this all this happened. All right, back to Freud. So anyway, this reminds me of your mom, and he was saying like as soon as therapy is beginning with the Freudian, they put it up and they take their toys back out. And like I think that's how Melfi handles that moment. It never comes up again. And that's the important kind of ball that you don't want to drop as a therapist, is when your client takes peyote, having an affair with the person who he kills the ex-mistress in Vegas and yells in the mountains. Like we've all, as therapists, seen that happen, and it's easy to miss that moment and its importance. So, however, these glimpses of the self are incredibly fleeting, because Tony's persona, the mask that he has to wear to control his identity as an Italian, as a man, as a Catholic, as a American, like it's very deep and threatening, or that mask is very heavy and it's very entrenched. And, IFS therapists would say that like his persona is very entrenched with that, with the self, and that they resist separation, that they fight separation. And I think like a lot of the change for anybody like Tony is going to be pretty gradual, and the gradual nature of change is probably going to be part of the process. I mean, Melfi's not incompetent, but she doesn't have a lot of tools in her toolbox other than CBT and analytic conceptualization. And then eventually you could get Tony to fully embrace that self, to realize that there was more to him, that there was more to life, that there were more to other people, and that would make him realize that there was another way of being other than all the things he has to do. Melfi misses a lot of opportunities with her modality, relating to his feelings about being trapped and forced to do everything that he does when he fundamentally isn't. He could be in control of his own life if he wanted to be. Somatic experiencing would be kind of an interesting thing, because that's what I would use for alexithymia. I'm not actually trained in somatic experiencing. I like a lot of it. Kristen Baer at Taproot is, so if you can see her. But we all do a lot of somatic medicine. And a lot of that would be interesting to have him recognize his kind of fight, flight, freeze, and when he's moving out of the window of tolerance. And when with the window of tolerance is like the most distressing emotion that you can tolerate, without just decompensating. You could teach him to recognize these panic attacks instead of continuing to dig around for insight and then doing breath work when they're actually happening and grounding. He could start to recognize his emotions better, which is something that he really doesn't do with Melfi at all. I don't know if that would be great TV, but, and so if you did more parts-based work with Tony, what you're probably going to end up with is like an angry, aggressive protector part, that emerges to defend against perceived threats, humiliations. He probably got that after the trauma of seeing that his dad fed their family by killing people and then feeling guilt when he ate meat. And then he, to just take control over that part, to have it not be this threatening thing. What a kid will do is say like, "Oh no, it's actually good. It's me. I like it. I'm that way too." And Tony definitely does that. He's either like a pitiful, helpless victim, or he's a committed, angry, vindictive sociopath. And I think parts where and sort of let him see when he made that decision and how in a way that's a lot more interesting than making it about sexual impulses directed at and violent impulses directed at early attachment figures. I don't think that there's a lot of real neurology there. And really, like, probably one of the reasons that Freud is even around at all, other than Anna Freud went to New York, and there's a lot of people that still live in New York, would be like that people like that as this lens to look at the underbelly of different like in literature and history, basically. Like Freudianism is around, probably because of Lacan, just in this way to like analyze things, that I think is not useful. There's also probably like a detached protector where Tony checks out and kind of just says he needs in high stress situations. That's like cynical and mistrustful. It's probably very funny. Like a ton of his humor is probably there. And, that may have emerged to cope with his lack of emotional attunement, and safety in his like early environment. And then also there's a vulnerable child part that you see a lot. Tony uses it manipulatively, like he shows it to Melfi, in times where he knows that he doesn't want to be pushed and that he doesn't want to go somewhere and he wants to get a certain reaction and he wants to evoke a maternal response in her. And by the end, he's really good at that, and he is controlling her. I mean, one of the most one of the ways that the conscious conceptualization of him being a sociopath is right. I don't think that he's bringing up babies and birds to to trick her. Like I think he genuinely is kind of enamored by those things, but like as a way of projecting like his own vulnerability, in an unconscious way. But I do think that he uses his vulnerable child to turn it on when he wants Melfi to become more maternal and not challenging. Because he tries to deflect with like humor, he tries to deflect by attacking her, he tries to control her sexually, and none of those work. But what gets him like a consistently positive response from Melfi over and over again is that he becomes a victim that is just so sad and young, and he learns to show the vulnerability. And it's not that the vulnerability is bad or he shouldn't be doing that, but Melfi doesn't really know what to do with it other than become more maternal, where parts work, where you can actually have multiple parts of self and not be in this Freudian and CBT conceptualization that Melfi's stuck in, would let you say, okay, you feel a little bit like this, but 2 minutes ago, you were attacking me. Do you feel both part? What activates physically when you're a victim and a vulnerable child and you're remembering when your mom's yelling at you? Do you just go limp and your arms hang down? Now, when you're activated and you're angry, you'll notice your spine. It's your shoulders up, like you in a boxer's posture. Like what do like a lot of that would make him start to, it would like chisel away at alexithymia in a way that none of her therapy does. There's also like this punitive parent part, that has learned that pain is good because it will teach people a lesson that they need to learn. I mean, it comes out a ton with AJ. I mean, Tony will beat AJ, or he'll hit him. He'll be physical with him. Usually when AJ is like exemplifying a vulnerability that Tony is not comfortable with because he learned that vulnerability gets you hurt. So and I do think it comes from a loving place. Like I don't think he is sort of a sociopath towards his kids. Like I think it's that thing where people feel like I'm going to hurt you before the world does because you're going to get hurt and you need to learn that. And it might as well be me because it'll hurt more if it's someone else. And that he's trying to toughen him up, if you will. Schema therapy would be kind of interesting. That's another parts modality, but it would probably be like an empathetic exploration of each of those modes' origins and their protective intentions, unmet needs, core beliefs that fuel each one. You'd probably have a lot more like not worksheets, but like maybe Melfi writing on a board, mapping this out so that he can see it. And there's also like I'd love to see chair work. Like I'd like to see that schema therapy or Gestalt therapy thing where they or voice dialogue thing when they make you switch chairs and like talk to different parts of yourself, or like have him talk to Carmela or his mistress when they're not there, like, and it's just his projection and his internal image. Like, I think that would have been a really, really cool and clarifying scene. That angry protector coming out and just yelling at an empty chair. I think that actually would have probably been pretty good TV. And then over time, I think, and it also, like, one of the criticisms of the show, just as the screenwriter in me, is like that they don't know what to do with Melfi halfway through, so they'll tend to like do things like make her an alcoholic, and then it doesn't really lead anywhere, or serve anything, just to continue to have like some kind of arc, because therapy is having to be part of the show, but then the show goes on for a long time. And I think if you had switched therapists, like if you'd had him kind of be more of like an in treatment type HBO show where he's in controlled therapy or something, and then different people evoke different reactions to him, like that would have been a pretty interesting idea. But again, like, Chase is a Freudian. It has to be this reenactment with the mother figure. Like, it's not interesting to him if Tony goes to the room where there's like, the weed smoking therapist in the leather vest that's like, oh, we're going to get your chakras to whatever. And then Tony's like, what the, and, or the scene where, he's with somebody who's, like you see some therapy with Melfi or with Meadow when Meadow goes to therapy. But it's all kind of like in the same world. The therapist's temperaments are very different. But like it's all very Freud, except for maybe the stand-in for Yalom. And then, internal family systems or something, you're probably going to get similar things to those other conceptualizations. Most parts work. I mean, it's semantics, two different words, but they're really doing the same thing. Well, I guess that's it. I've got to get to bed so I can get to Mr. Wings early tomorrow to get that all-you-can-eat buffet. I just think that's going to be my Holstons. And it's not going to be anybody in a members only jacket. It's going to be me never the port. Just kidding. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's interesting. It's a lot of sort of thoughts put together, but I'm meaning to do something on the Sopranos for a minute, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thanks.
Wounded in similar ways, wounded in similar ways. It sounds like something that a hippie would say, but the truth is we're wounded in similar ways.